This third section, we're going to start talking about worms, and the first group of worms we're going to talk about are the segmented worms. So the segmented worms are defined by the fact that they're made up of multiple segments which are separated by a dividing wall. And many times you can see it. For example, each of these lines is not representative of a segment, but if you put several of these together, you end up with a segment which has a dividing wall, which is called the septum. Now, the segmented worms are divided up into flat worms and round worms. In the diagram, we are showing what is a common earthworm, which is one of the roundworms. And this is the common earthworm, and what we see here is multiple segments, as I said before. Start at the mouth, something called the prostomium. The prostomium is used to push through the dirt so that it can get through the dirt. There's a very small gathering of nerve cells, which could be called a ganglia, but are also called a brain. You move on down, you have the pharynx, the esophagus, where the food moves through here, actually dirt mostly, and then into the crop, which we recognize as a storage center, a gizzard, which we recognize from previous exposure as the area where the food is ground up, and then it moves into the intestine. Once it gets into the intestine, it's a very long intestine until ultimately it's expelled through the anus. This right here is called the nephridium. Nephridium is the worm's kidney. We have the aortic arches, which are what would loosely be called hearts, and then two blood vessels, a dorsal blood vessel up here and a ventral blood vessel here. And these are connected through these aortic arches here. The seminal receptacle is where the sperm cells are taken for reproduction, and then you have these little spiny things that stick out that help the worm move through the ground. So these bristles or spiny things or setae, there are 4 bristles in each segment, and they're used for locomotion. Gas exchange or respiration is through the skin. And sensation, the worms can actually sense touch, chemicals, and electricity. And electricity, they actually react quite violently to electricity. As I said, the circulation is through these aortic arches and then up through the dorsal and ventral blood vessels. And these aortic arches function as hearts. Digestion starts at the mouth, goes through the pharynx, through this area of the esophagus and into the crop. Like I said, the prostomium is like a shovel that moves dirt into the mouth. Excretion is through the nephridia, which acts like a kidney. These are tubes that function as a kidney to excrete liquid waste. The second group of worms are the sea worms. The sea worms are the largest class of segmented worms. This is just an example of the sea worms. This is called a bearded fireworm. And they have what's known as parapodia. The parapodia are a pair of fleshy lobes on each segment that assist in movement and gas exchange. And here, these are the parapodia. Here's one, here's another one, here's another one. Everybody knows what a leech is. A leech is a worm that can attach to and acts as a parasite. Leeches have no setae. They have a sucker on each end of their body in which they attach, and they produce an anticoagulant. The anticoagulant functions to prevent the blood from clotting that they absorb through their suction areas. In addition to the earthworms, there are flatworms. The flatworms have no segments and have a flat body. And this shows the eye spot on this end, which is the light-sensitive area, the brain, no segments. Here's the pharynx, and the mouth is actually down here that takes in the food, the gastric cavity being here. And then down here are sensory nerves that sense the external environment. A planarian is a form of flatworm. It's non-parasitic, and it has these light-sensitive areas, and they actually are kind of interesting looking. You see here they look like they're cross-eyed. Now, what's interesting about a planarian or many flatworms is you can cut them into pieces, and they will reproduce into multiple worms. They reproduce both sexually and asexually. And actually, you can even cut their head in half long ways, and then they will produce a worm with two heads. And I actually did this in a biology lab when I was in high school. Now, the problem with flatworms is many of them are parasites. One group of parasites is called a fluke, and this diagram shows the life cycle of a fluke. And it starts when the sheep eats grass that contain the cysts of the fluke. These will mature into flukes. So the cysts enter into the digestive system of this sheep. The fluke then lives inside the sheep liver and gallbladder. There it lays eggs that travel out through the sheep intestine into the feces. The egg exits through the feces and goes into water, where it hatches into a larvae. The larvae reproduce inside a snail, and then the larvae leave the snail and swim in to the grass and end up in the grass. They lose their tail and form the cyst, and then the cycle goes again. And there are many of these parasites that require two organisms in order to reproduce: the sheep, and in this case, the snail. The second group of flatworms that act as parasites, the first group being the flukes, are the tapeworms. And the tapeworm has what's called a scolex, and the scolex attaches to the intestinal wall. And then the tapeworm extends out from the scolex into the intestine and essentially absorbs the food that is meant to be absorbed by the intestine. The other group, the non-flatworms, are called roundworms or nematodes, and they can also act as parasites. One example is the filaria, and the filaria gets into the body and then ends up in the lymphoid system of the host. And when it gets into the lymphoid system, it can clog the lymphoid system, and it causes obstruction of the lymphoid system. And this causes a disease in humans that's called elephantiasis. And this is because the filaria block the drainage of lymphatic material primarily from the lower extremities. The other type of roundworm is called a heartworm. Humans don't have problems with heartworms, but heartworms can form in animals such as dogs and cats. Here is an example of elephantiasis. This side is the unaffected leg. Here is the affected leg. And what you see is a huge dilation of the leg, which is caused by lymphatic obstruction. Once it occurs, it's very difficult to do anything about it because the lymph system is very difficult to manipulate. Another group of roundworms are called hookworms. And hookworms, again, also live in the intestine, but instead of absorbing the food, what they do is they attach to the intestine, and the blood actually goes through the hookworm, and they use that blood to absorb nutrients and oxygen. And here's how hookworms get into the body. They start out, and the larvae are in pastures and so forth, and they go up through bare feet, which is why they tell you when you're in the pasture for horses and cows not to walk around in bare feet. They get into the bare feet. The larvae pass through the bloodstream, migrate to the lungs, where they are ultimately coughed up and then swallowed. And then the worm, a mature worm, attaches to the intestine, and then eggs from that mature worm pass out in through the feces, and the cycle begins again. This is the reason when you're in pasture lands, you don't walk around in bare feet. Another roundworm is called the trichina, which causes a disease called trichinosis. This is a very similar problem. The pig takes in the infected waste that has the trichina in it, and this pig's muscle is infested with a cyst from this worm. It then, if the pig meat is then eaten by a human, if it's undercooked and eaten, then this cyst enters into this person's body. The worm then matures and migrates out and gets into the muscles of the human, while the larvae from these worms pass out into the feces, and then the cycle continues again. Now, trichinosis can cause significant pain in the muscles and something called rhabdomyolysis, which is when the muscles lyse as a result of this infestation. And when the other thing that can happen is called cystinosis, which is when these cysts get in the brain of individuals that have eaten this meat. That's why there was an emphasis many years ago on cooking pork very, very thoroughly and not serving raw or undercooked pork. This is much less of a problem now because of the way that pigs are raised in the United States. So trichinosis is an infestation that's caused by poorly cooked pork.